Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today you can see I'm wearing my Count Dante shirt, deadliest man alive, and you can tell from that I'm going to get very serious today because I've got a serious topic I want to talk about, and that is the insane, mind-blowing explosion in prices of comics over the last year, but specifically the last 2 months. um, for those who are buying comics, old issues, this is of no, this isn't exactly news to any of you, but for those of you who maybe haven't been paying close attention to the market, prices have been going absolutely berserk in the last few months, particularly since COVID started. But just in the last couple months in particular, there's been this massive swing in prices, with some books doubling in value over the course of a single month. And I'm not talking about books that weren't worth anything. I'm talking about big blue chip major keys doubling in value, sometimes tripling in value in the course of just a month or a few weeks. It's absolutely ridiculous. If you go into eBay and look at the sold listing history for certain key books, you can see from the beginning of February to now in the middle of April an exponential growth in the prices of these books. And so I want to talk about that today because I think there's a lot of stuff going on. I'm reading a lot of things on different forums about this where people are asking, what's happening? Why is it happening? Is there going to be a crash? When is there going to be a crash? All of this sort of stuff. And so I wanted to just give sort of my thoughts on this because I think there's a lot of different things happening that have sort of all come together to create this perfect storm that's causing this massive boost in prices. I do think there's going to be a market correction, but I'm not sure when, and I'm not sure how big of a correction it's actually going to be. I am not sure we're going to have the huge crash that a lot of people are suggesting. So the first thing that I think is happening, again, I've already mentioned it, is the COVID stuff. So, for the last year, people have been in lockdown. You haven't been able to go out. And this has resulted in a few things that I think have combined to see the massive boost in prices. First of all, people are bored. Second of all, they can't do anything. So a lot of people, they're stuck at home for an entire year. You can't go out to the movies. You can't go to the baseball game. You can't do any of those fun things. And so you have to do stuff in your house. And so a lot of people that maybe were spending that money on other pursuits now are turning it into comics, which is the third factor. Because people are not doing all of those other things, there's a lot more disposable income. Now, some people are also getting the bonus of the stimulus checks. Now, for a lot of people really need that stimulus money. But for people at the higher end comic book collectors, if you've already got the disposable income to be spending, $500 or $1,000 on a comic book, you probably don't need the stimulus money to go towards your bills, your rent or your food. And so that's just sort of extra money on top. So the COVID situation, the longer it drags out, there's a section of collectors who are really bored, have a bunch of extra disposable income that they haven't had before because they're not spending on everything else. They're getting stimulus checks that they don't need. And so what they're doing to entertain themselves is a little retail therapy, going online and buying these comics. And they're buying back issues that they never had the money for before, or that they've always wanted, and things like that. And so I do think that there's been a big boost because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So one of the questions is, what's going to happen now that people are starting to get vaccinated and things are starting to get back to normal? I think it's still going to be 6 months to a year before we get close to normal, and that's assuming that nothing goes wrong with any of these, new strains that are coming out. But the question is, are we going to see a drop in prices because those people are now spending money on other things? They can go out and do stuff again. I mean, I don't think so. I think that once people start spending money on other things, it's going to maybe slow the growth. But I don't think that that's going to be a factor in any kind of price correction or crash. It's just going to be because I think the people that are buying comics for those reasons, for that reason, are real collectors, and they're not going to want to get rid of the books. Like, they're not going to be selling off the stuff that they just bought. So I think a lot of the gains that we've seen due to the COVID stuff is stuff that is going to stay. The second thing that's clearly happening is we're getting new people coming into the market, and I think we're getting a couple different groups of people coming into the market. And that's really sort of the heart of what my video is. I think there's a group of people that I call, the kids with their GameStop money. The youngsters that have made a big fortune, they just invested in GameStop before the big thing happened in Wall Street, and now they suddenly have $800,000 to blow because they got all this free money from GameStop. Now, I don't have any proof that that's actually true, but the way people are spending money, that's how it feels. Like a big crop of people has come in out of nowhere and is just dropping tons of money. And I think that's actually true. There's a couple different types of speculation that I think are happening here that I don't necessarily think are completely connected. We have the movie speculation that's been going on for a long time, but it's been going really crazy again during this last year with the COVID stuff, where people are taking, these comics for characters that are there's not even like a legitimate rumor. It's just pure 100% speculation. Like Defenders 112, the first appearance of Arcana, right? There's been nothing anytime suggested in any way that Arcana is going to ever appear in any kind of Marvel movie or TV show or anything. However, when WandaVision was coming out, there was a character in there who was blonde, and there was a couple lines in the show that suggested she had some sort of importance. And so everybody just started trying to figure out who could this character be. And someone suggested Arcana because it's a blonde woman with magic powers. And now that book is like a $50 book or more. That's just nuts. That sort of crazy speculation has been going on for a little while and has gone completely out of control, in my opinion. Everybody's speculating wildly on these back issues. That, to me, is where we're going to see the most volatility in terms of market correction, because the shelf life of those books is only as long as that rumor is valid or current. And so we see books that spike up to $50, $100, $150 overnight, and then the character doesn't appear in the show, and then they drop back down to nothing. Although they never actually drop all the way back down. A book might go up 10 times in value and then drop by 2/3, and the result is it's still worth like 3 times as much as it was at the beginning. That sort of thing, I do think we're going to continue to see lots of volatility in that sort of market, and steep drops when either the character doesn't show up or the character does show up and everyone thinks that it's crap, because we've seen that happen a few times. The first appearance of the Mandarin was hugely hyped going into Iron Man 3, and then everyone hated what they did in that movie, and that dropped way back down. Same thing with the first appearance of Ultron. Again, more valuable afterwards than before, but they had a huge spike and then a huge decrease, and we're going to continue to see that, I think. One of the books that's been going crazy the last year is, for instance, Avengers 8, the first appearance of Kang. Kang's my favorite villain in comics, so I love Kang. I happen to have a really, really nice copy. It's probably, an 8 or so. It's ungraded, but it's around an 8, maybe a 7.5 at worst. And I've seen that book suddenly go from being like a $200 book to being like a $1,500 book or whatever the heck it's going for now. It's absolutely crazy. I'm skeptical that it could possibly maintain that. I think when Kang finally appears in Ant-Man, he's going to have to be really cool. He's going to have a long-term impact on the MCU beyond just a single film. Like, we have to know at the end of that film that he's coming back and that other things will be influenced. It's the only way that book can hope to maintain the value, and even then, I don't think it will. So, I think we're seeing a lot of new pure speculators coming in who just are looking at what kind of turnover profit can I get right now? What book can I buy for $5 and then flip for $100 next week and just turn this stuff over? And those are mostly dealers, either professional dealers or amateur dealers who don't, they deal with comics, but they're not collectors. And so that to me, there's almost no long-term sustainability there. It's just flavor of the month. They just cycle through all that stuff because they're buying and selling to each other. There's really no end consumer to that. And that's why we always see the crash at the end, because you build up this hype that this is going to be something valuable, and then people start buying it because they believe it's going to be valuable. They see it going up and they want to buy it before it goes up more. They want to buy it now so they can flip it for more later. And then it ends up that someone ends up always holding the bag on those because there's no intrinsic value. We're seeing, though, I think a couple other groups coming in and who are doing something sort of similar but not exactly the same, and I think that's going to have a much longer term impact on the market that's a little bit harder to figure out. If you look at some of the other collectible markets, you're going to see that comics is not the only area where that's had this massive, ridiculous spike in prices and values over the last just few months in particular. Sports cards, for instance, if you look at that, they've had a thing where the most expensive sports card, football card specifically, so the most expensive football card ever sold was sold in like January or something for like $450,000. And then that was beat out in February by something that sold for like $600,000. And then that was beat out later the same month for something that sold for like $800,000. And then in March, a football card sold for $2.5 million. And so you're seeing this ridiculous growth. And at the same time that we're seeing the ridiculous growth in the comics market. But there's other markets too. The non-sports card market has seen absurd price surges for certain like Pokemon cards, but also things like the Star Wars, the movie cards that used to be popular in the late 70s and into the 80s. And there's been this massive surge in the price of Marvel trading cards from the 90s. A lot of that has to do with those cards now being graded by grading services like CGC. But we're seeing this huge surge across the board, and some of those other markets have already had massive crashes. We haven't had that yet in the comics market. And I think what's happening is, part of what's happening with comics is we're having this massive influx of people from these other collecting fields, where when those prices on those other collectibles surge through the roof, they look over at the comics, and the comics suddenly seem like a huge opportunity because they seem so cheap in comparison. And so I think there's people who they're speculators, but they're almost investors in a different way. They look at the comics and these other things as sort of like stocks, like the stock market, like blue chips, and they look over and they look at these key issues. And I'm not talking about like overhyped movie key issues for characters that may or may not appear, but I mean actual key issues, things like Fantastic Four #1, X-Men #1, Avengers #1, like first appearance of Ghost Rider, things like that. So those books, they look at those, and then they look at the price of those in comparison to, Pokemon cards or football cards that just came out, and the comics are so much cheaper that they suddenly seem like an incredibly good deal. And so the people that they're getting out of priced out of that market, maybe they just flipped a bunch of stuff. They bought this football card for $500. They sold it for 10,000 at the peak, and now they're going to take that money. They're going to move it into comics, and so we're seeing this influx of people from like the card communities and the other collectible communities that are not comic book fans, but who are investing in comics. I don't want to say for the short term, but I would say for the medium term, because they're not buying them because they love the comics. They're buying them because they see the growth opportunity. And once that's started, we're seeing this trickle effect here. So I'm going to show one of my books here, which of course is my Avengers #1. It's CGC 3.0. And there's been, just in the last 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, a sudden surge in price in Avengers #1. Now, Avengers 1 is a book you would think would have been going up the whole time, but actually it hasn't. So my Avengers 1 here, again, is the CGC 3.0, and over the last 10 years, I would say the value of that has gone up by only $1,000. Maybe it's gone from $1,500 to $2,500. Hasn't even doubled in value, despite the fact that Avengers during that time period has become literally the biggest entertainment franchise in the entire world. But that price, that popularity has not translated to a big increase in the value of Avengers #1. But now, all of a sudden, it is. And why? I think it's a trickle-down effect, because what's happening is the money pours in from these other people coming in. They start buying up these key issues. Collectors who have always wanted those key issues, like real comic collectors, are now seeing books that they've always wanted, maybe they've been saving up their money for. They're starting to get out of reach. And when I say starting to get, I mean like overnight, they're suddenly out of reach. And so those people are sort of panicking a little bit and being like, well, I've been saving up all my money to get an X-Men #1 for the last 5 years, and then overnight it doubles in price. And so I'm going to take that money and I'm going to buy this other key that I wanted so I don't miss out on that key. And so because of all the massive price increases, we're seeing a snowball effect where the collecting community is now like, I've got to get this stuff now before it goes up even more. And so they buy it, and then that, of course, causes the prices to go up even more. And that brings in more of the speculators and the investors who are like, oh, the comics are going crazy. I'm going to get this thing because it's gone up by 50% in the last year, and it's on the rise. And so the reason I wanted to show the Avengers #1 is, like, I almost got caught up in this myself. I very briefly earlier this week considered buying a second copy of Avengers 1 because, again, if you look at the relative value and the relative growth rate of Avengers compared to some of the other books that have been going crazy, Avengers 1 now looks like an incredible deal. I think that's why the prices have suddenly started going up. Now, as of 6 weeks ago, if you look at again, sales histories, there's a couple Avengers 1 through CGC 3.0 that sold for about $2,500. Now, 6 weeks later, it's looking like the book is more like a $3,500 book. Their sales, or if you go on eBay and try and get one, the $2,500 that people were getting for 3.0 last month is what people are now asking for a 2.0. There's like copies, that are a 1 or below that people are asking $2,000 for, which is part of a whole different story. I think, just a brief aside, I think on a lot of these keys, there's now a floor. People used to think of it being like a linear, like a very straight arc, This, it's the idea that there's like a $500 value per grading point. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I think what you see is it starts up much higher and then flattens out. So the difference between a 1.8 and a 5 is not that much because the floor has raised so high. So like the fact that if you look at a CGC 3.0 and it's at 3,500 and a 2.0 is at 2,500, you would expect to get a 1.0 for like between 1,000 and 1,500, but you can't. It's still going to be like 2,000 because there are people that are willing to pay a certain amount for any copy, and then it just sort of goes up from there. And then, of course, when you get to the top level is when it skyrockets. But again, back to this Avengers 1, X-Men 1 has been a book that's gone absolutely insane, like insane over the last year or so. And so an X-Men 3.0 sold on eBay just a couple weeks ago for over $16,000. Now, Avengers 1 and X-Men 1, of course, they came out at the same time, same month release date. And X-Men 1 has, for the most part, has always been more valuable than Avengers 1. And I say always, but at least since 1980 or so, because the X-Men in the comics have been more popular, but also because X-Men #1 is the first appearance of a bunch of characters. All of the X-Men and Professor X and Magneto are all first appearances, whereas Avengers #1 is the first appearance of the team, but not the first appearance of any of the characters in the comics. So X-Men #1 is the more important book. It's always been worth more money. But when you look at the disparity between an X-Men 1 selling for $16,000 and then an Avengers 1 in the same condition selling for $3,500, Avengers 1 starts to seem like a ridiculous value, especially considering, again, Avengers is the biggest entertainment franchise in the entire world. And so that's why I think Avengers 1 has started taking off over the last few weeks, is because people realize that it's way undervalued relative to the new overvalued amounts of some of these other books. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this Avengers 3.0 gets up to $5,000 or even $6,000 in the next 3 months or so, which is why I considered buying a second one, because I think there's no way that this book should be worth 1/6 the amount of X-Men in grade. I think being worth 1/3 the amount of an X-Men in grade is more appropriate. But that's one of the factors, and this is also one of the factors why I don't think we're going to see a massive crash. Okay, is because part of what we're seeing is collectors buying things that they want. It's collectors saying, "Oh, these prices are going crazy, and I need to get it now before it goes up anymore." So they buy it now, but they buy it not intending to resell it. And so I think at some point someone's going to be left holding the bag when the prices get too high. It's going to level off, and I think it's going to drop down some. But I don't think we're going to have a massive market crash on these types of books. These key, like legitimate key first issues from the Silver Age and Bronze Age first appearances, I think we're going to see a market correction where they might drop back 50% of their value, and that's still going to leave a lot of these worth 3, 4, 5 times as much as they were before this spike started. And that brings me to the other group of people coming in, because I think part of the reason we're not going to see a big crash is because I do think, this is just complete guess on my part, but it's just a feeling that I have, that these new people that are coming in the market with all this money, they're not just investors, they're not just speculators, which again I think are mostly professional dealers who are dealing in the lower level stuff with the quick flips, with the movie hype. And I also don't think they're just investors, like people who are collectors in general, but not comic collectors, who are coming in from baseball cards and stuff and seeing these as undervalued relative to other collectibles and are investing for the medium term, right? I think there's another group of people that's coming in, money that might be staying in comics. And it's odd because I don't think that they're actually comic book collectors. But I do think we're seeing a new generation of younger millennials and even the first people from Gen Z that are starting to get a little bit of money, who don't read or collect comics the way we older school people do, but are huge fans of the characters. Now, this has always been something that people have been expecting, that comics will get a big boost in readership because of the popularity of the movies, and it's never happened. You would think that because Avengers is so incredibly popular as a movie franchise, that you would see a bunch of those people going to the comic stores or reading Avengers, the comics online, and that has never happened. But, again, pure theory on my part, I think some of those people are actually coming in to buy back issue key issues only. I think that we're going to see people who love the characters because of the movies and the cartoons and the TV shows and all the other media stuff, who love that stuff, don't read or collect comics or comic runs, maybe read the trades occasionally. That's about it. But they want this. They want the key issue. They want the first appearance. Again, I could be completely wrong, but there's a thing in collectibles called the rule of 25. And that's the idea that when something gets to be 25 years old, the people that were into it as a kid are now adults and have the money and the nostalgia to rebuy them. And that's when you start to see the prices go up, when something gets to be about 25 years old. In my experience, I think these days it's closer to 30. I don't know if that has to do with that we have less disposable income now than the previous generations did, or what. But I have definitely seen that. If you look at books from the late 80s and early 90s now, books that should not have any value, like Spawn #1, which was the biggest selling comic of all time, basically, when it came out, with the possible exception of X-Men #1. I forget which came out first or second, but Spawn #1 sold like 2.7 million copies. There's nowhere near that many people that care at all about Spawn. So this is a book that shouldn't be worth anything, and yet nice copies, and frankly, almost every copy of Spawn 1 is nice because people bought 100 of them and then bagged and boarded them and put them away. So they're all unread, right? They're selling for $20, $30, $40 each now because of the nostalgia, right? When you look at the ridiculous value increase, price increase of X-Men #1 and Giant Size X-Men #1 are books that are doubling, tripling in value in the course of weeks, and in grade. You know, the Giant Size X-Men #1, there was a thing where 9.8 or something sold like 6 weeks ago for $56,000, and then another one sold just a month later for like $95,000. So you're seeing at the highest levels massive price jumps from day to day. And I have this suspicion that what we're seeing are fans of the X-Men who don't read or collect the comics but love the characters. Because if you look back, we're at the point where the X-Men cartoon now is between 25 and 30 years old for most of that run. And if you look forward, this year marks the 20th anniversary of, or the 21st, I forget now, of X-Men the movie. And we're getting to that point where people who are nostalgic there's going to be a whole generation of people that are nostalgic for the X-Men who have never read the comic. And some of those people are going to be buying X-Men 1 and Giant Size X-Men 1 and Hulk 181 and stuff like that, and not anything else. And I think part of what we're seeing, as part of everything else I've talked about, with the extra disposable income, the young people with money now due to GameStop or whatever, but young, like people in their 20s that are entering the hobby either through collectibles, other like baseball cards or Pokemon cards or Magic cards, they're moving into comics, or who are thinking of it as a more fun stock market. Young people bringing money in, we're going to see, I think, more of that. So I don't think this is all just speculators coming in and raising the prices in this frenzy. I think some of those people are going to stick around because I think we're going to see this new generation, and it's just not what we expected it to be. We always thought that in order for the back issue market to be healthy, we need comic book readers who care about the stories. And I think what we're actually going to get is a whole generation of people who are buying the key back issues like Avengers 1 and X-Men 1 because they love the characters so much from the movies and the cartoons. And so the bottom line for me is that I think it's dangerous to buy anything right now because you have no idea. It's very possible that if you bought something now, we could see the big market correction tomorrow, and then you be the one left holding the bag. But even though I think a large part of this is basically a pyramid scheme, I'm not sure how big the pyramid is. We might only be seeing the tip of it. It's possible that the pyramid is this big and we're only at the top of it, and that we won't see this big market correction until after COVID or even after that. And when we do see it, I think we're going to see a lot of overhyped movie books are going to be dropped down to nothing. But the big keys with the big characters, I don't think they're going to drop that much. I really don't. You know, that X-Men 3.0 that I just talked about that sold for $16,000, if we had a market correction tomorrow, might drop down to 10, but that's still going to be a lot more than it was 3 months ago when you could have got it for 5. And so I think we're not going to see the kind of crash that people are anticipating. I think we're just at a inflection point with a lot of different factors coming in. And I think as much as I think we're going to have a market correction, the prices dropping back down, I think part of what we're seeing now is actually a market correction of things going up to where they should be. If you consider the fact that instead of having just this tiny hardcore collector base, there's actually a much, much larger group of people and collectors in general who are now in love with these characters. So, sorry this took so long. Anyone who managed to get through all 30 minutes, I commend you. There's a lot of things to think about in terms of whether to buy stuff now, to wait, to sell things. The kind of what I'm doing is for books that I no longer really feel are part of my collection or fit in my collection, I'm considering selling them now, now that they've gotten so much more valuable than I ever expected, and using that money to buy other comics that I want. And that way you're almost trading like for like. And so if the value of the book that you buy drops down, you don't feel like you've really lost anything because the value of the book that you sold also would have dropped down. You know what I mean? The bottom line for me, if you want to avoid all of the market volatility, is my advice is the same no matter what's going to happen in the market, and that is simply this. Buy books that you love. Buy books because you love the book and you want the book. If you're worried about the price fluctuations or losing money, simply don't speculate in anything, because what I've found is when I have overpaid for a book or I've bought a book that's dropped in value, it only bothers me if I don't care about the book. If I bought the book because I love it, I get so much more value from the book that's not connected to the monetary value that I don't mind if the monetary value goes down, because I have gotten my money's worth from the sheer enjoyment of owning the book. And I think that continues to be true in the future. You know, if you're worried about spending $3,500 on Avengers 1 now because you think it might go down to $2,500, I would say only buy it if you love Avengers 1. If you love the Avengers, it's not going to bother you that much that the value goes down if you're not planning on reselling it. So that would be my advice to anyone anyway. You know, just buy what you love and you won't have to worry about any of this stuff. But I do enjoy, you know, buying back issues. You know, I enjoy digging through back issue bins and finding deals and flipping them and stuff. It's a lot of fun. There's a certain amount of speculation in that sense that I enjoy doing. And so seeing the market go crazy like this, um, it's it's a weird time to be a collector. So let me know what you think below, and I hope this was of value to someone. Again, I'm sorry I talked so long, but there's just a lot to unpack here, and let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.